Anyway, I do remember there was a great deal of optimism surrounding all this development that had been actually coming on for decades and had finally gotten to this point. A lot of kind of utopianism. And I found this quote from Fred Turner's How Digital Technology Found Utopian Ideology from the first Hackers Conference, which happened in 1984. This was in Critical Cyber Culture Studies. But he writes, in the mid-1990s, as the internet and the World Wide Web went public, a utopian near consensus about their likely social impact seemed to bubble up out of nowhere. The net would level social hierarchies, distribute and personalize work, and dematerialize communication, exclaimed pundits and CEOs alike. The protocols of the net were said to embody new egalitarian forms of political organization. They offered the technological underpinnings for peer-to-peer commerce, and with them, claimed many, an end to corporate power. And well above the human planes of financial and political haggling, suggested some, those same protocols might finally link the now disembodied species in a single harmonious electrosphere. I thought that just really summed up the optimism. And I have the, the metaverse up there because, and I'm not totally against the metaverse. I like virtual reality myself, but I don't want to like work in it. Okay. And I found it interesting to see how Meta is now, well, what Facebook used to be, Meta is now kind of trying to like promote this idea that we can do everything in this virtual reality. But I noticed that they're not getting as many like very enthusiastic utopians to follow in that trend, because it's clear now that this utopian idealism is easily subverted. And I would posit, like, one of the things that I see in Vork's Hacker Manifesto is still a little bit of a hangover from the 80s and 90s. Okay, the manifesto was written in 2004, and those are the sections that I covered for this week. In 2003, 2004, this was still a time when computer technology and the internet gave a lot of people hope for great democratization. And we'd be able to use it to vote. Everybody would vote. Everybody would get a voice. And there would be so many possibilities for cooperation, and we could bypass corporate power. Jared Lanier is one of the people who was in on the ground floor of the development of the internet and all of this, and went from somebody who was very optimistic and kind of blown away by it all to somebody who was quite sad and now goes around giving talks about how you need to get off social media and stop being preyed upon. So it was a time, though, in the 2000s when some of that optimism was already starting to wane, because we could see that there was this emerging battle, this struggle going on between the hackers, who were still conceptualized as this kind of, world-saving heroic class potentially, and the vectorialists who were seeking to make money off of it somehow. Okay, that was still, now it's like ubiquitous. Nobody can make money if they're not on the internet, right? But hardly. But back in the 90s and even early 2000s, it was difficult for people to figure out exactly how to do that. Some hackers became vectorialists, became people who mainly were about making money. But, Mark Zuckerberg is an example of somebody who started out rather idealistic, and he invents Facebook, and he's about 20 years old when he did it. It wasn't monetized in any way for a long time. They couldn't figure out how to do it. As a stock investor myself, I kept watching Facebook and wondering, how can he figure out how to make money off of this? Okay, of course he did in a huge way. So this is a quote from article by Bruce Baker, Sin and the Hacker Ethic, a tragedy of techno-utopian ideology in cyberspace business cultures. I found it interesting because this author looks at that sort of utopian optimism that probably originally inspired somebody like Mark Zuckerberg, but then how that utopian ideology kind of more or less glossed over or created this veil or this kind of ideological narrative that people could still tell themselves and each other at the same time this technology started to be used for money making and beyond, to become very intrusive and very negative in people's lives. So this guy says Facebook's power to manipulate the personal information and news feeds of billions of people is due to the streak of idealistic thinking that has nourished the roots of the hacker way. Facebook employees do not go to work intending to do harm, like the founders of Google, who touted the motto, "Don't be evil," which is kind of like, what was it? Just be good, or don't just say no. They tacitly accept the hacker's manifesto that their code can and should propagate social good. These are, by and large, idealistic believers in Facebook's potential to do good. As Zuckerberg tells it, Facebook was never intended to be a company, but rather Facebook was built to accomplish a social mission, to make the world more open and connected. I found it interesting how, over these decades, that corporate ideology continued to be voiced, even though the purpose of Facebook metamorphosed into something that's become quite harmful to many people, as well as to our country and its national security. So Mark Zuckerberg became what Mackenzie Wark calls a vectoralist. He went from being a hacker to a vectoralist, to a CEO who primarily didn't do his own hacking, but got others to do it as he tried to figure out how he could monetize and build a business empire out of Facebook. Vectoralists, Wark theorizes, are a new ruling class. So one of the chief, points that she tries to make in this and other works is she thinks we have this new ruling class, that we are no longer in effect capitalist in our system so much as vectoralist. Now, many people have argued, no, that's a distinction without a difference, but she would beg to differ, because the major corporations like Facebook no longer own the means of production. They don't own the factories. They control the, quote, means of production, the factories, from afar through their information technology. So they contract with people who actually are on the ground, risking all the physical things that come with doing things like farming, producing things in factories, selling things in actual physical stores or in warehouses. They contract that all out. Like Walmart in last week's example, they use information technology to get all this done, to like orchestrate it all. And they hire or contract with so-called creatives and hackers to manage all that and to forge new vectors, which are connections, product sources, and marketing schemes. They don't own the means of production. And now the owners of the means of production are actually in a subservient position. So that's why she thinks it's a new system. An example of this is Moink. Some of you are probably familiar with Moink. It is a company that advertises on XM radio and other sources to hook you up with free range meat, organically grown food. This is just some wording from their website. I won't read it all, but our vision to become a go-to source for humanely raised and ethically sourced meats for the consumer, as well as an outlet for grass-based farmers to sell their proteins. And they kind of effect this like rural kind of accent in their ads with, "You'll just be so pleased that you chose Moink." I mean, really, when you think about it, it's kind of distasteful. These two started it. And so Moink is not that different from Tyson. If you think about it, Tyson and Moink, they're both vectoralists, okay? Again, this is from Tyson's website. "We don't own or operate any feedlots, so we buy cattle from nearly 4,000 independent feeders and ranchers, and they supply our beef plants in the Midwest, South, and Pacific Northwest." Same thing, they're most famous for their chicken farming. "We supply the birds, feed, and technical advice, while the farmers care for the chickens by providing the farm, housing, and labor." Well, as Jacob implied, and Kloppenberg is also implying, farmers were and are, in some cases still, a type of hacker. They literally work with nature, and they figure things out on the ground in a very creative way sometimes in order to produce well in their area. It involves a lot of problem solving, but operations like this take all of that away. It's not an art. It's not even a skill to a certain extent. It's just following directions, just like, you know, the person at the checkout counter that just kind of stands there while you check yourself out. So there's a great de-skilling going on here. And even though Moink sounds different, and I'm sure Tyson doesn't care quite as much about grass-fed anything, they're actually kind of similar. They're both vectoralists. So the vectoralists are the owners of Moink. The hackers are the technology people that create the Moink network, which mainly involves information technology from procurement to delivery. And the creatives are the ones who market Moink. They're a type of hacker too in McKinsey Works terminology. Farmers have been largely relieved of their hacking duties. The farmers were originally hackers. And hackers, in Work's view, have all this potential. I'm positing that that there's some utopianism left in Work, right? Because she's looking at the hacker class as a class that has enormous power because there's so many of them, especially as she like redefines them to not just be computer hackers, although that's an immense amount of power if it could be harnessed, but like creatives and, you know, people like farmers as well, anybody who creates a difference and something new. It's a lot of power if these people could realize that they are a class. And see, that's a part of her agenda as well. Realize that you're a class. So it's the old class consciousness idea, okay? Now, she points out the government and industry alike overwhelm hackers, so that there's become a closer and closer, you know, connection between government and corporate business to the point where you can't really tell them apart. She uses the term military information complex because in her view, and I need to explore this more, but it sounds like she sees, you know, corporate power kind of using the same sort of structure and military mission mentality and, you know, all of the different outsourcing and connections that the military does. It seems kind of corporate in a way, and the US government more generally. Government and corporate concerns are so intermingled that you can't tell them apart, even though we've had this trend in privatization. But when you think about it, privatization just means government telling corporations to do its work, and then they become extensions of government power. So in reality and in our lived experience, the government is actually, its purview has grown exponentially, and corporate power has become a source of governance over us, controlling a lot of what we do and how we live. Government and corporate concerns therefore are now vectoralist in nature. They use hackers to extract incredible amounts of data and wield that knowledge as a source of power. So I think both should be included in that vectoral class. This is a quote from Wark. The vectoral class uses the state to extend and defend the privatization of information. It attacks the socialized science, culture, and communication and education that other ruling classes, for the most part, left in the hands of the state. That would be like Kloppenberg's treatment of the early land-grant university mission and how that changed and became a corporate mission over time. There is an intellectual land grab going on. Then the irony of vectoralists selling back the information that they've extracted from hackers and creators and producers. And in our, you know, context, the great irony, for instance, of the many farmers who cannot feed themselves, okay, and have to buy back almost all their food from a grocery store, even though they somehow technically feed, though they're only growing one crop in a lot of cases, 155 other families. So I will try to be brief, but I want to argue, even though I think Wark would not, but I guess I want to argue that maybe we can find some moral arguments kind of hidden in here When Wark says things like the productive classes are so-called because they are the real producers of wealth, be they farmers or miners of land, workers of material or immaterial value, or hackers who produce new means of production itself, as though the productive classes should be owners of what they do and have the freedom to do it, and they are not being allowed their freedom. Okay. She's asking them to attain class consciousness, to take back what is rightfully theirs. Okay. There is this notion that, well, as she says here, hacker history not only represents to the productive classes what they've lost, it expresses what they may yet gain, the return of their own productive capacity in and for itself. And history, she says, then can show us that things have not always been the way they are now, and they can be otherwise. And I relate that back to Kloppenberg's history. Why is he giving us this history? Partly to show us that things have been otherwise. That doesn't mean that we should go back, but it does mean that perhaps we will not always have to live with this particular system, right? Other things are possible. A more modest appeal than completely free information, which I'm not even sure I'm on board with, okay? Because I think if we did it all of a sudden anyway, it would be pretty destructive. But I would just propose that, why are we not considering seed development and distribution and food itself to be something along the lines of some of these other things that government still allows to be regulated and to be distributed? We have laws that say you can only hold a copyright on your drug for a certain, or a patent on your drugs for a certain amount of time, then it goes into the public domain so that the cost can go down. You can only, like have copyright on your books for so long, right? And then they become the public domain. It's pretty long, but at least there's an end to it, right? Some municipalities say, we're not going to let 10 garbage trucks roll over your street. We're going to have a municipal garbage system because we value your health, your auditory canal, and, your actual street. Water is not something that multiple companies buy and sell. Government still supplies it in the United States at the municipal level. So it's not as though we don't sometimes have a notion that there are certain things that are so important that maybe we shouldn't just allow monopolization or, corporate control to be to dominate. I'm not sure why it is that we couldn't apply that to the seed and even to food, which we need as much as water.